I would like you guys to watch this video that talks a little bit about the concept of intelligence and race and how those two things intersect. We will actually circle back to this issue a little bit further on in the presentation. As we are going to kind of find out throughout this presentation, racial traits are classically viewed as being innate. It wasn't really until more kind of recent science from about the 1970s onward that we really realized that a lot of these assumptions that we made based on genetics, intelligence, and race were incorrect. We still, every once in a while, and we'll talk about some of the modern race theories or intelligence theories later, but they still pop up every once in a while, but they're all really based on this notion of hereditarianism ideology, and we've kind of already talked a little bit about this, and it's a concept in anthropology in general that we refer to as biological determinism, right? That all characteristics of an organism are innate. So an example that we like to use to kind of show the ineffectualness or the kind of incorrectness of biological determinism or hereditarianism ideology is this notion of shyness, right? How do we trace shyness, right? A lot of little children are shy when meeting new people. Some little children are not shy, right? So can you consider shyness a biological trait or a social trait? Is it something that children are born with, or is it something that they are taught through interaction? So, long story short, we know that more heavily it's taught through interaction rather than biological, but it just kind of illuminates the notion that there are traits that are with us that we have that, may have roots in both of those areas, right? There might be some degree of biological heredity involved in it, and there may be some degree of social interaction and enculturation involved in it. So we'll kind of look at a few of these issues as we move forward. So the Hereditarian Theory of Intelligence or intelligence quotients, right, are based off of a researcher we're going to talk about here in a second called Alfred Binet, and he derived kind of our original IQ score. So it's based off the assumption that all intelligence is innately determined by your genes, right? But this is based on a big misunderstanding of two basic concepts in biology, right? These hereditarian theories equate heritable with inevitable, right? Just because you inherit a trait does not mean that that trait cannot be acted upon by environmental forces, right? We've talked about throughout the entire semester from an evolutionary standpoint how the environment plays a huge role in determining your outward physical appearance, right? But, well, as you adapt to that environment, you adapt both physically and socially. And all of those factors are going to play a role in things like intelligence, right? So heritability is not inevitability, right? The also starts with kind of the confusion of within and between group variation, right? If we look at just the notion of intelligence, you're going to have a huge variation in intelligence based on each individual's life history within a population, right? There's going to be some people who are smarter, there's going to be some people who are not as smart, right? And that's all based off of a complexity of factors involving a little bit of heredity, tiniest bit of heredity, right? And mostly social factors, right? Learning, enculturation, school systems, resources that have been given to school systems, all of those things play a factor in determining what intelligence is. So if we look at our different types of determinism that we see here, we have biological determinism, which we've talked about. All traits are innate and controlled by your genes, right? But you also have this notion of environmental determinism, right? That all traits are influenced and shaped by environmental factors. It's actually going to be a little bit of both of these issues or both of these concepts that really have an interplay in how an individual's life history takes place, right? It's a kind of a notion that we refer to as interactionism. So interactionism, on its basic sense, is the belief that all human traits are developed from the interaction of biology, your genes, your heritability, right, and your environment or your rearing, right? So what we're really saying here is that no singular determining factor determines things like intelligence, right? It's always an interplay of things like social factors, like education, and child rearing and enculturation, environmental factors, right? What restrictions are placed upon your culture by the environment, and of course your genes, right? What is your basic starting capacity. So we've talked about this concept before, the notion of the great chain of being that kind of influenced scientific thought during the 17th through 19th centuries. It's essentially a ranking system, right? And what's more important is that this system also influenced how societies rank via intelligence, right? Those who are lower on the ranking scale are perceived as being less intelligent, right? In certain terms of most animals are considered to have no intelligence at all. Therefore, they are much lower on the scale, right? So those individuals or societies, essentially, or cultures higher on that chain are closer to God, higher intelligence, and therefore better than those who are lower on the chain. So for most of the semester so far, we've focused on kind of racial classification systems that were focused on physical differences such as skin tone, right? But along with a lot of those early classification systems, they also focused on mental differences, right? Intelligence has always, in essence, been a factor in rank-based human systems, right? So let's take a look at a few early thoughts on race and intelligence. Oh, if we look at good old Thomas Jefferson, right, one of our founding fathers, he actually, in his writings, noted a suspicion that blacks are inferior to whites in both mind and body, right? And in essence, what Jefferson was really echoing was these racial classification systems that allowed Jefferson to view African Americans as separate creatures, essentially, right? It explains how one so apt to proclaim liberty and equality for all can still own slaves, right? There's this disconnect between recognizing them as, quote, fully human. Even Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, did not actually believe that African Americans were equal to whites in terms of intelligence or in terms of physical ability, right? He felt that blacks should not be able to hold land or be able to vote, although he was elected on an abolitionist platform. In his own writings, he says, the physical difference between the white and black races, which will ever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. So what he was saying is that the actual physical differences would forbid us from ever being able to live equally. So if we look at the early science of measuring intelligence, it really first started in earnest by a gentleman named Alfred Binet in France. What he originally sought to do was actually, in a project that he started before this, which we'll talk about here in a second, he was actually looking to confirm Paul Broca's notions that you can measure intelligence based on cranium size. So he was actually a student of Paul Broca. But his actual study that led to measuring physical or actual intelligence was originally meant to explain differences in school children to help develop better educational programs for the public education system in France, right? So the goal of ranking humans based on intelligence was used to justify social inequality through biology. Unfortunately, that was not what Binet's original conception was, right? He was actually doing this in earnest to help improve the condition of all school children in France. But once Binet's intelligence scale gets to America, that's when it's really used to justify social inequality through biological factors. So at the start of Binet's development of intelligence testing, he was originally looking to or sought to prove Broca's assumptions about brain size and intelligence, right? So he started by measuring school children. And what he found was that the differences in skull size were so small in these children that they could not explain the intellectual or intelligence or learning differences that he was actually seeing in the children in their behavior. So the recognition of the negligible difference between skull sizes in French school children really caused Binet to kind of go back and look at Broca's original numbers, and Binet started to recognize that there was bias. And he actually wrote about it, that bias is, essentially injected into any scientific study. And from his paper relating to the topic, he stated that suggestibility works more on a half-conscious act than on a conscious act. And what Binet was really getting at here was this notion that if you're going into a scientific experiment looking to collect evidence on something specific, that you may actually unconsciously, whether you realize you're doing it or not, inject bias into your research, right? So you have to be ever conscious of the potential for bias in your own research. But this led Binet to differentiate between two different types of intelligence, right? He said that there was natural intelligence, right, a capacity that we're all born with, which he said was relatively equal amongst all humans. But he also said there is instructional intelligence as well. This is the intelligence that you're given through schooling and enculturation. And the interesting part is that Binet actually believed that, in some sense, the French school system, at least, was so heavily enculturating children on a classist or class-based level that children of lower classes were actually being given or basically instructed on how to be less intelligent. He was basically saying that these school teachers were injecting their own bias based on their perceptions of what the students' class was. And what this led to, according to Binet, was really a restriction or kind of a clamping on the natural ability of some of those children to learn. So in essence, Binet was hired in France by the Minister of Public Instruction to find a way of identifying students who were not bright enough to be in the regular school system in the early 1900s. Essentially, what he was trying to do was provide suggestions or provide candidates so that France can set up a special education program. He came up with something called the Binet Intelligence Scale. Today it's called the Stanford Binet Intelligence Scale after it was refined at Stanford University. Binet had difficulty defining intelligence and came up with the four elements of direction, adaptability, comprehension, and self-evaluation, right? How good is a child at following directions? How adaptable are they at changing circumstances within a given task? How well do they comprehend the tasks that they are asked to do? And how well are they at evaluating their own work? In all of Binet's conclusion, he essentially denied any interest in ranking or labeling children with respect to intelligence. He actually recognized the dangerousness of such a system. And he also wanted his test to include not just written activities or a written document, but also a variety of tasks and activities. And he concluded that a child's mental age was recorded as the age of the last task that the child could complete in the sequence of tasks that he had developed, right? His kind of testing system was later used by American psychologists to develop a ranking system of intelligence for races, countries, and even cultures. So the conclusion of Binet's study, or basically his suggestions that he made to the Minister of Instruction in France, was to develop a program he referred to as mental orthopedics, which was a more holistic approach to education, where he would actually use both physical activities that were designed to kind of develop motivation skills, goal achieving skills, things like that, alongside mental activities with education in terms of learning out of books and kind of your classic sense of education. And Binet actually suggested that they should re-educate the educators on how to do a mental orthopedics program, which was a more kind of more whole approach to student education. And in Binet's opinion, a better approach to student education. Unfortunately, although Binet put those suggestions forth to the Minister of Instruction in France, and there were some programs that were developed based off of that, what the rest of the world kind of got out of Binet's research was this notion of intelligence quotient, right? It's the notion of an IQ score, right? And this was later defined as the ratio of the individual's mental age to his or her chronological age multiplied by 100, right? So thus, a 12-year-old child with a chronological age of 12, right, of average intelligence, a mental age of 12, would have an IQ of 100, right? 12 divided by 12 times 100. Conversely, a 10-year-old child who has an intelligent quotient or who is as intelligent as an average 12-year-old would have an intelligence or IQ score of 120, right? So this is how they derive those intelligence scores. So, in terms of IQ, it was originally devised by Binet as a system to objectively measure the capabilities of children in order to help develop better educational systems. But once it got to America, it quickly became the numerical score for what level of intelligence an individual can expect from themselves, right? So, and think about what kind of that means for an individual, right? Once you take that IQ test and it tells you, well, this is how smart you are, right? You may actually unconsciously deny yourself or not push yourself to learn more based on that kind of assessment of what your innate intelligence is, right? So Binet's conception was from an environmentalist perspective. Like he was said that it was really these children's rearing and the environment that played a role in how intelligence is formed. But once it got to America, American scholars reframed it in kind of a determinist ilk, right? It's kind of to support the ongoing eugenics movement in the early 20th century. Henry Goddard was a fairly influential American scholar. He was working on looking at intelligence, innate intelligence in individuals, and he actually a lot of his work was used to later pass immigration law, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But he said in his book Human Efficiency in 1920 that government schooling was about the perfect organization of the hive, right? So he believed that standardized testing was a way to recognize or to make lower classes recognize their own inferiority. And as a matter of fact, he added 3 additional categories, and this is where we get these words in our lexicon today. He added the categories idiot, imbecile, and moron to Binet's intelligence scale, right? And he believed in practices like forcing less intelligent individuals to wear dunce caps because he believed it would discourage them from breeding and having ambition. So other than adding those 3 additional categories to Binet's intelligence scale, he also created a home for the feeble-minded where he experimented on his residents. And he also did a lot of writing about this, what he termed the Kallikak family, which is actually a fictional name for the Wolvertons. And it was a family as kind of the proof that he used of the hereditability of intelligence. It's actually a really crazy story in terms of what Goddard said about this individual woman that he had living at his home for the feeble-minded. So in essence, the story goes that, oh God, so this is actually outrageous. I mean, when you kind of recite this today, it's relatively shocking. But so Martin Kallikak was an individual who was a Revolutionary War hero. And upon returning from the Revolutionary War, on his way back to his wife, who was a, quote, wealthy, intelligent Quaker woman, and he ended up having a dalliance, as they say, or an affair with a barmaid of low intelligence, right? And in essence, what happened is that Martin Jr. was born from the dalliance with the barmaid, and Martin Jr. was of much, much lower intelligence, right? All of the children that were born of his, quote, intelligent, wealthy, and Quaker wife, all were normal, had no problems, led successful lives. But all of the children that came from the union of Martin Kallikak and the low intelligent, or in H.H. Goddard's words, the feeble-minded barmaid, resulted in feeble-minded individuals. It went so far as to, in his book, when he published the photos of the Kallikak family, they actually doctored the photos to make them look like they have heavier brow ridges, and they're kind of scowling and demonic, and definitely looking of creatures of less intelligence, less human, as a matter of fact. So here we see a picture of Deborah Wolverton, which is her actual name, but H.H. Goddard renamed her to Deborah Kallikak, and he used her as an example of, well, when you remove a feeble-minded child and give them very basic education, you can make, and don't allow them to breed, you can make a feeble-minded person a decent citizen, in Goddard's opinion. So in terms coming from Goddard's writing, he said, a child was born by the dalliance with the nameless, feeble-minded girl. The single child, a male called Martin Kallikak Jr. in the book, right? His real name was John Wolverton, went on to father more children, right, who fathered their own children and on down the generations. And so with the Kallikaks, Goddard claims to have discovered, as one has close to as one could, imagine an experiment in the hereditability of intelligence, moral ability, and criminality. So in essence, what Goddard was really saying with the Kallikak family is that people of lower classes were less intelligent, not because of unequal educational opportunities and not because of unequal distribution of resources. They were less intelligent because of their innate feeble-mindedness, right? That it's really, the leading to things like criminals, leading to things like moral inability, right? So the way Goddard kind of sought to institute his theories and ideas essentially through public policy was to come up with his own scale that he added, basically adding onto Alfred Binet's intelligence class, right, or test, right? So in essence, what he focused on was mental defects and creating an intelligence ranking system. And surprisingly, when he ran his tests at Ellis Island, he found that up to 80% of adults coming from Russia, Hungary, or from Jewish descent were classified as feeble-minded, right? So in essence, what he was really doing was reflecting the social eugenics movement of saying that we don't want people from Eastern Europe and we don't want people of Jewish descent because we believe in terms of eugenics that they are genetically inferior to Western white Europeans and white Americans. So this is just showing you Alfred Binet's scale, which really stopped at the below average mark. What Goddard did is he later on came and added the borderline, moron, imbecile, and idiot category. So at least all this really does for you is tell you, well, when you are calling someone an idiot, it is much worse than calling them an imbecile. So in letters and actual congressional hearings on immigration, Goddard made the following policy suggestions. He wanted to raise the standards for allowing immigrants to enter the country using intelligence testing. He also suggested that we limit the breeding of the already feeble-minded that were here. So essentially what Goddard was saying is that he wanted his test to be implemented on a wide scale and allow that test to be used to deny people access to the United States and also to classify people as feeble-minded and put them into homes and essentially sterilize them as well.